I'm the do every Thursday from 5:30 to 7:30, and where we introduce. I'll let these folks come in. Hi, take a seat. Every week we have artists, publishers, curators come and speak about work. So either they'll be living in the Hudson Valley or in the region, or they're visiting. So keep your eyes out. We'll have a lot of really fun people coming to speak this summer, including all of our artists in residence. So that'll be good. Tonight we have Marina Caron, who is in her final stretch at CSS Bard in the Curatorial Studies program. Marina Caron is a curator, writer, and researcher based in New York. Marina is currently a master's candidate in curatorial studies at the Center for Curatorial Studies, Bard College. She has a BFA from Cooper Union. And she's going to be talking about a show that she's curated of Bettina Grossman's work, which is called The Fifth Point of the Compass. And these are free, so please take one. They're very cool. And I guess you came to this connection through working with Ido Barada, who is the director of Bettina's estate. So that's where that connection. A lifelong New Yorker, artist Bettina Grossman, 1927 to 2021, lived and worked for nearly 50 years at Manhattan's storied Chelsea Hotel. Bettina traveled in Europe from 1957 to 65 before settling at the Chelsea Hotel in 1972. In 2010, Corinne van der Borsch released her film Girl with Black Balloons, which led to Bettina's encounter with artist Ido Barada, who had been instrumental in the resurgence of interest in Bettina's work. I'm going to let Marina really go into the details of this, but can we give her a warm welcome?
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks CPW for having me. Yeah, I'm Marina, and as Sarah said, I'm going to talk about artist Bettina Grossman. She went by her first name, so I'm just going to, her first name only, so I'm just going to refer to her as Bettina. And I'm going to talk about her major project, The Fifth Point of the Compass, which is the subject of my thesis show, which is up at the Hessel Museum until May 28th. Bettina worked in projects, and within a single project, there could be many works. So this exhibition focuses on this one of her larger projects called The Fifth Point of the Compass. And all of the works in this project emerged from a photographic practice that she had from 1977 to 1985, where she shot over 8,035 millimeter color slides from her balcony and then tagged them all with descriptive labels like baby on back or long package seen here. And then she sorted them into categories based on these terms and then alphabetized them. These are two sheets of slides from the centerpiece of the current exhibition, which is one work from the larger project titled The Fifth Point of the Compass, New York from A to Z, Studies in Random Constant, Fixed Focus Time Lapse. Her titles are always very long. So I'll refer to this work as New York from A to Z going forward. But this work comprises nearly 1,100 slides. And here's an installation view of the exhibition. New York from A to Z is in the middle on the table. And on the surrounding walls are related works from The Fifth Point of the Compass and other projects, as well as archival material. And it's important to note that how she would have shown New York from A to Z isn't known. So it's shown as it was found, which is as a set of 57 sheets of color slides. So it's kind of like unstable material that's in between artist archive and artwork. The title was listed on her list of works, and the binders that it was found in were labeled with that title, so we know that it is the work, but it was important to kind of maintain that instability because that's, you know, as it was. So as Sarah said, Bettina was born in 1927 in Brooklyn. She grew up Orthodox Jewish, and she worked as a textile designer in New York before she traveled in Europe from 1957 to 65. While she was in Europe, she worked with marble in Italy, stained glass in France. She also designed textiles in Paris and London. She worked for Knoll Associates and the William Morris Society collection. And when she returned to New York, she had a studio in Prospect Heights, and in December of 1966, a fire burned down her studio building and destroyed all of her work up until that point. So she was 39 years old, as one curator's noted in an essay on Bettina, for like a woman artist of this generation to lose all of your work at that point was like a major setback. And that was kind of a defining event that she often talked about, like when I worked with her in the last few years. Yeah. And then she settled at the Chelsea Hotel in 1972, where she continued working. In 1980, she had a solo exhibition at Soho's O.K. Harris Gallery that featured some works from the fifth point of the compass. And then jumping ahead in 2010, Corinne Vanderborsch released her film, Girl with Black Balloons, and then introduced Bettina to Ito Barada, who's been instrumental in the resurgence of interest in Bettina's work. And Bettina passed away in the fall of 2021. Yeah, this is like the top of her CV. It says, born in New York, autodidactic, 10 years Europe, all works destroyed by fire. It's 1966. And this is just like quick intro to her practice overall. This is like a statement she really liked that art historian Reinhold Hull wrote about her work. He says, among all the aspects of contemporary life, she has chosen the most disturbing one as the underlying theme of her sculptural and photographic works, the modern bondage to the concept of great numbers and our subjection to constant change. So my exhibition comes out of a very particular moment in Bettina's career that I want to highlight, which is this moment of like renewed interest in her work. And these three people, Ito Barada on the left, who's now the director of Bettina's estate, Corinne Vanderborsch, who made the film, and Gregor Huber, who's collaborated with Ito on a lot of projects related to Bettina, are instrumental in this moment. And to quickly go over like some of the things that have happened recently, these are install views from a show at LMCC on Governor's Island. These are Bettina's marble and woodworks here, and Ito's work up there. Some more views of Bettina's sculptures. This is from MoMA PS1 Greater New York. She was featured with photography and marble works. Last summer, Aperture published a monograph on her work that you should all check out if you get a chance. It's a really wonderful book. And then at the same time, there was a show last summer in Arnold of her work. And I'm sharing all this to like describe what my exhibition is emerging within, at the same time to kind of emphasize what type of project is happening around Bettina's work, which is about getting the work of an under-recognized artist like to the public, but it's also about securing the future of her work and about making a case for her importance. I first met Bettina in 2019 when I was working as Ito's studio manager, and I spent that whole summer with Bettina in her apartment at the Chelsea, creating a rudimentary inventory of her work in preparation for the LMCC show. And through those months, I got to know Bettina's work quite well, and we also became friends, and I continued working with her on the monograph, for example. And one aspect of Bettina's work really stuck with me and informed how I approached this exhibition, which is that she staunchly rejected the logic of the singular art object and said her works had to be seen in relation to one another. They couldn't be seen in isolation. And here's a couple quotes from her writing about this aspect of her work. My work is serial sometimes, sequential sometimes, evolutionary sometimes, and there is no such thing as one of each. Each work is but an element in a process to be woven into a vast world of interrelational hidden meanings, whereby each is relative to the other, incidental to each other, interdependent upon each other, unified and shaped according to each other, materialized according to each other into a greater whole, wherein your involvement evolves into one greater unity. And that's very like also characteristic of her voice. She has a very like unique and distinct voice. And this was also reflected in my attempts to inventory her work, which was like a real challenge. I would be like, Bettina, is this a work? She had copies, so many copies of everything. And each copy had like, you know, a new composition of the same elements or handwritten notes. And every time I'd be like, is this a work? And she'd always say yes. And I was like, okay. And like that challenge against like what are really like curatorial or administrative attempts to like fix a work, the way that her work challenged those conventions was like very compelling and interesting to me. And this aspect of her work led me to this question, which is really behind a lot of how I thought about the show, which is what does it mean for exhibition making, scholarly interpretation, methods of display, and art in general to confront a body of work that structurally rejects the logic of the singular art object, where the work arises from the relationships and coincidences between a fluctuating number of objects that emerge from different projects affiliated with specific systematic processes designed by the artist. And that question of how to show this work guided my selection and display. It's a big part of why there's so much work, and how I came to this design where the central table works to like guide viewers around, but they always have to kind of see that work in relation to other things and draw connections to other things that she was doing. So this is like kind of where the show begins, and you go left to right and it guides you around that way. And on the label for this central object, I have a quote from Bettina's description of the Fifth Point of the Compass project. Within prefixed boundaries, the self-container, I am documenting daily urban activities in fixed focus from the fifth floor. The pavement grid structure becomes the universal constant within which inner city energies are contained. Identifying features of passing pedestrians are isolated at random and organized alphabetically. Selective retention. The strange recurrence, both within my fixed container and within minutes of each other, specific constants repeating themselves. Once elusive, transitory, inapprehensible energies are here reposited. This project is about every man, every image, to help us see others, to see ourselves, to see at all. And the restraining structure stamp here seems to refer to the 2x4 grid, which references the grid of the sidewalk, which is present in all of the images. And the images are each taken from her balcony on the fifth floor. You can see her railing in the lower edge of some of the images, like a black line on the bottom. And the grid of the sidewalk sits parallel to the camera, so the focal plane is evenly distributed. There's no focal hierarchy in any of the images. And each figure becomes flattened against the grid. And yeah, as I said earlier, it's not known how she would have shown this work. So many of the slide sheets have these blanks, and I'm not sure where they come from, but that was just left as they were found. The first group along the wall is a selection of lists Bettina produced from the categories of New York A to Z. Here's a couple of them up close. These are lists of all the categories. And she produced like a bunch of versions of these. She did handwritten versions, which are also in the show. And there's like a way that she works where she's always kind of going back to her own work and pulling out other media, pulling out one media from another. So text comes out of image, or sculpture comes out of photography also. And part of what I wanted to draw out with the show is that this work, the two media of the work are photography and text, and that they can't be separated. It was also common, as I said, the photography becomes a kind of source material for other media. And this is like Robert Blackburn, who was an artist, director of New York City's printmaking workshop. He wrote about this aspect of her work. The photographic medium is employed not only for documentation, but as an endless source of inspiration from which other disciplines emerge and merge, which we'll see again later. And as I said, she did have a show in 1980, and she showed this project from the Fifth Point of the Compass, which is called the R series, which are 5x10 grids of single categories that begin with R. And they were each about like this big in their form. The originals, we aren't sure where they are, but we have slide documentation that she took. So that's where these images came from. And it could be that she would have presented New York from A to Z in a similar way. So it was important to include these because they indicate how she might have actually finished the work, like printing the slides and typing the category names rather than having handwriting, which like really changes it. And here's the flyer from her OK Harris show, because they opened 4 exhibitions at any given time. And there was only 2 years where they didn't document one gallery, and that was when she showed. So there's no installation views, but c'est la vie. And interestingly, OK Harris was the first New York City gallery to show color photography in a commercial setting. So it's also important to remember that the time she was working in is a time when color photography wasn't taken seriously as an artistic medium. So there's a lot of ways that her work might not have been so legible as an artwork in its time. Oh, yeah. And one way that both New York from A to Z and the R series operate is through this mode of visualization, in which pattern and information are presented visually in an immediate and accessible way. And this idea of visualization is really tied to technology. This is also like a time when cybernetics, systems theory, information theory really influencing like the greater culture, but also artists, like the Information Show at MoMA in 1970, for example. And like a lot of conceptual artists were engaging with these questions. Orrit Halpern, historian of technology, computing, and media, she defines this term visualization. And I won't read this whole thing, but it basically I'll read the end part. Visualization slowly mutated from the description of human psychological processes to the larger terrain of rendering practices by machines, scientific instrumentation, and numeric measures. Most importantly, visualization came to define bringing that which is not already present into sight. Visualizations, according to current definition, make new relationships appear and produce new objects and spaces for action and speculation. And they're very tied to pattern recognition, the sense that something that wasn't visible becomes visible through a way of organizing information. This is another work made contemporaneously by Mariana Vex. This is an excerpt of the work, Let's Take Back Our Space. With a full title, Let's Take Back Our Space, Female and Male Body Language as a Result of Patriarchal Structures. And though she was primarily a painter, Vex produced this one immense quasi-sociological phototext work, which she showed on panels and printed as a book. And it consists of over 2,000 photos, some taken by the artist and some found, that are sorted into categories such as seated persons, leg and feet positions, or seated persons' arm and hand positions, that are then divided by gender. And while both Vex and Bettina go through these motions of creating data by accumulating images and text, transforming it into information through tagging and sorting, Vex uses that to create a message, like there's a clear social critique in her work, while Bettina's work doesn't send any particular message because the repetition in itself is significant for her. So her categories are like kind of crucially arbitrary. It's more about the fact of the repetition for her, whereas for many other artists of the time using these information aesthetics, it was about social or political critique. But Bettina did see photography as a mode of collecting information. She says, I really like the camera. If you're photographing, you're taking it from outside and bringing it in, you're adding information to your repertoire. And that kind of mode is also the same for Mariana Vex and other artists of that time. So there are the R series reproductions in the show, and this is another photographic work that she produced as part of the Fifth Point of the Compass called 29 Boxes, 16 Images, 15 Minutes, 2 Men, 1 Hand Truck. And the title just describes what's happening in the work. And in this work, 2 men disassemble this like grid of boxes on top of the grid of the sidewalk. Yeah, and then the title card is there. Here's a closer up image of these. And this is what's on the back of the newsprint poster. And this also relates to a lot of like conceptual art practices of like designing a system that you carry out, which produces the work. So authorship is displaced. And then after the photographs in the show, I started to leave the Fifth Point of the Compass a little bit to draw out connections to other projects. So here I brought out 4 slides from New York from A to Z and put them alongside an earlier project called The Hand Clasp, which are a series of sculptures and photographs of the sculptures. So the slides are hands clasped and images of people doing this on the street. next to these sculptures. And even though they came earlier, so it's not like a one-to-one that she made the sculptures from the slides, these kind of connections are really important to how her work operates, which is much more about like a way of seeing and noticing repetition and pattern. And next to the hand clasp is a vitrine with works from another large-scale project from the fifth point of the compass called the Headline Project, which she worked on between 1979 and 1988. And this project consists of many elements, including lists of newspaper headlines, printed photographs, and between 300 and 500 slides. Unlike New York from A to Z, these photographs were staged. Bettina collected newspapers over the course of a year and invited a performer to walk down the sidewalk while reading them and being photographed. And the newspapers are primarily issues of the New York Post with headlines that often refer to crime or violence. And she began this work at the end of the 70s, which is a decade in New York City's history, characterized by economic crisis, infrastructural decline, and a sense that the city had been abandoned by the federal government. But then, whereas in New York from A to Z, she's drawing text out of the images, here she's using found text, putting them into the images, and then pulling them back out again to create lists and lists like this of all of the headlines, along with collages she made of like different headlines next to one another. And a lot of these are like really characterized as by negative affect, like crime, violence, and this kind of paranoid energy in the work also reflects the time period, which was one of justified paranoia with like COINTELPRO and the Cold War. Like this is a time when people were thinking in that way quite widely. This is a still from Corinne's film of her looking at the, her showing her the Headline Project slides. And the fifth point of the compass in general, and speaking of paranoia, anticipates a lot of surveillance forms that seem really ubiquitous today through vertical perspective and this core practice of non-consensual images of people in public space that are then transformed into data-like information. But the work kind of avoids that topic more directly through the arbitrariness of it, where for Mariana Vex, the patterns are kind of used. For Bettina, pattern in itself is meaningful. And this is a quote from this interview that one of her fellow residents did with her in 1980. She said, "Pursue it up to a certain point where I could see that it would go on forever, and therefore it wasn't necessary to arrive at any more conclusions, that the resolution was there because I could see that it would go on to infinity, and I couldn't spend the rest of my life on one project when there were so many to do." And the point was to prove that all of them would be endless, and it wasn't necessary to conclude them. It was a resolution rather than a conclusion. And this idea of like what she's doing is like creating a proof of a pre-existing interconnected system. And so what you're seeing is always kind of like an arbitrary fragment of this fact that she's trying to expose. Here are a couple more prints. She produced a lot of prints from the Headline Project. Help me, I'm being killed. Help. I also pulled out in the show a few word works not related to the fifth point of the compass, again, to kind of like point to how she's working with text. In the work on the left, English for Foreigners, she creates a list of homonyms. She also has another list, another word work not here called B photo object. That's lists of words that start with BE, words that start with BA, words that start with BL. And the one on the right, the compression work, she printed that on many different scales by itself. And on this version, she prints it alongside verbal forms, which are elements of letter forms isolated and then repeated in different combinations. And she also made those in black marble that she then photographed in different orientations. So this sort of like mode of moving things in and out of 2D and 3D and back into 2D, that was really important to her work. And the compression work, she was in Paris in May '68, and she made that as a response to those events. Another interesting aspect of this work of New York from A to Z and the fifth point of the compass in general is its like semi-relationship to a document or to a document of the city at this time. So Following her exhibition at OK Harris, Stephen Miller, who was then curator of paintings, prints, and photographs at the Museum of the City of New York, wrote Bettina expressing interest in acquiring pieces from the Fifth Point of the Compass project because he saw it as a unique documentation of a hitherto uninvestigated aspect of the city. And I got in touch with him as part of my research in the past year, and he said that he had a larger project at MCNY to discover new images of the city. And it turned out they didn't end up acquiring the work. And we don't know why, but it's interesting that it was received as like artwork and document. Martha Rosler, another work of this time period. Martha Rosler's famous The Bowery and Two Inadequate Descriptive Systems is also like an interesting comparison to Bettina, which because it's also an experimental document of New York City, but has such a different mode where Rosler is describing the inherent gap between text and image. These are all images of the Bowery next to images with words related to different states of drunkenness. And the work is kind of about foreclosing the connection between text and image and disrupting it as a critique of documentary practices, particularly exploitative documentary practices. So where for Rosler, it's about the gap, in Bettina's work, text just proliferates out of the image, and the sense of the fragment that it could just keep going on is very present. Another interesting comparison, Douglas Hubler's variable piece, number 70, the project to archive photographs of everyone alive. And this idea of comprehensiveness, which again points to this like fragmentary nature of Bettina's piece, where it's always a fragment in relation to this posed, infinitely large system. And then the last comparison I want to draw is Hannah Wiener's poetry. She literally saw words and she would transcribe. She saw words in space and she would transcribe them, and that transcription became her poetry. So this like photograph is like her with the word because that's how she saw the text that she was writing. Which relates to Bettina's emphasis on vision. She, in one of her writings, she says, if you have gnosis, see things around you that others do not. Your responsibility is to absorb it, express it, transmit it, so that others may open their eyes to that which exists outside of themselves and the limitations of what they normally see and do not see. Art is not an idea, but an experience. And that was like also an interaction we had a lot when I was working with her, because part of my task was to learn more about her projects. And I would be like, Bettina, what's the idea behind this? And she'd be like, there's no idea, just look at it. Like, what's wrong with you? Yeah, and then, or she'd like laugh at the word concept if I ever said it. So there's an interesting relation between her and Wiener because it's a kind of literal relationship to what they're doing. Joyelle McSweeney writes that about Wiener, that the text that follows does not recreate, as some would have it, her experience of clairvoyance, but resembles and is continuous with her exteriority, itself covered and in contact with language. And I think that's the same for the Fifth Point of the Compass. It's not about expressing an experience of vision. It's about actually creating work that gives people an experience of a different kind of vision. Bettina said she had two works about New York City, one anthropological, which is the Fifth Point of the Compass, and one phenomenological, which is another project called Phenomenological New York. And this is like a letter from a curator at the Brooklyn Museum in the 80s who also saw the OK Harris show that says Bettina is as much an anthropologist as she is a photographer. And Milstein points also to the way that Bettina's work implicates you, like you feel like when you could be one of these people when who's walking down the street. Yeah, one by one they move beneath the eye, running, reading, bearing umbrellas and newspapers, radios clutched in their arms and pressed to their ears, a continuous coterminous phenomenon, a rhythmical refrain of men, women, and children. Bettina is consumed by constant energy. And these are some samples of phenomenological New York that are in the show. So she made a lot of these. Phenomenological New York is characterized by distorted reflections in like metal and glass surfaces of the city. of mostly pedestrians or street traffic. So on the left, there's a Super 8 film of movement as seen through reflections. And on the right are 2 photo collages. She made a lot of collages like that. And then in the middle, this type of page is really characteristic of her larger body of work, where she takes like samples from different projects and puts them next to each other. So here, a still from Phenomenological New York is on top and on the right, and on the bottom left are samples from the fifth point of the compass. And in the middle is a sample from her project Keys on the Quai, where she zoomed in on a keyhole in France, and then she made all of these repetitions of different keyhole shapes and kind of made this allusion to like them looking like human forms, and made wood sculptures out of them that she called them like figures or couples or various things like that. And here's some more stills from Phenomenological New York, and this is one of her, on the right is like one of her title pages that she made. Okay, and the last aspect I want to talk about her work is, I want to talk a little bit about with her work is her relationship to dimensionality, which is something that she talked about in the description of the Fifth Point of the Compass project that I read earlier. But she often talks about this word D-dimension, or uses this word D-dimension to describe what she's doing, which is like taking something from 3 dimensions and moving it into 2. So here's the excerpt of the Fifth Point of the Compass description that mentions this. Through strategies of repetitive process, multiple images of similar distinguishing characteristics are presented as icon, object, event, socio-history, gesture, and incident. At once ordinary and global are transformed into pure form as the human form becomes de-dimensionalized. D-dimension as a state of being, revealed as a mystic cosmic energy. And on one copy of her description of the project, she has this handwritten note, D-dimension as a state of traumatic paralysis, D-dimension as a state of undeveloped potential. And there was a lot of notes like that, like defining what D-dimension is. And then this work on the right is part of her finite structures project, but you see like her kind of translating what was a sculptural form into drawing, into line, and moving things into different states. So one interpretation, I don't know if this is the case, of the Fifth Point of the Compass title is that the fifth point is the camera. So while all the figures are de-dimensionalized and put into 2D, like she is the third dimensional vision kind of like presiding over this project. She was really influenced also by fourth dimensional geometry, and particularly of P.D. Uspensky, the Russian mystic mathematician. And this is like Linda Dalrymple Henderson, who's the art historian who like really specializes in the influence of the fourth dimension on 20th century art. She writes a little about Uspensky, that he developed a mystical interpretation of the fourth dimension, associating it with infinity and the achievement of cosmic consciousness of a truer four-dimensional reality. If Uspensky was envisioning a liberating effect, quite different from Hinton's more pragmatic approach, the theme of the fourth dimension as a liberating agent of some kind ran through most all of its interpretations. And this idea of like liberation and higher dimensional vision comes up in Bettina's writings a lot, that there's if you can see in this way, it comes with like a moral responsibility to share it because it has liberating aspects to it. I won't read this, but there's also this kind of idea in fourth dimensional geometry that figures in four-dimensional space can move through spatial barriers without puncturing walls. So there's this sense of like collapse between inside and outside, and a kind of like superhero fantasy of like superhero 4D people who have this like total freedom of movement. And this is a work, samples from a work of Bettina's called The Inside Outside House from the 60s, which is a direct reference to fourth dimensional geometry. And these were also influenced by binary, like computer binary. And she made these drawings and also made sculptures in marble. And I showed some of these in the exhibition to show how these like motifs reappear in the fifth point of the compass project, like some of these black and white checkered motifs, and that these kind of like more abstract, esoteric, geometric projects have direct relationship to the New York works. So here are some, on the left are some drawings called Hidden Agendas. Then the Laundryman, she has 1 million copies of this one image from the fifth point of the compass. And on some of them, she draws this line along the grid of the sidewalk. And here's like the one that is most that she worked with the most from the Laundryman. And then the last thing I want to say is also that she, while a lot of her work has these resonances with photo conceptualism and like dematerialization of the art object, that she really held on to material, and she worked in stained glass. Here's more stained glass. She also made a ton of these drawings on graph paper that are very colorful. And I think that's something that kind of makes her work really interesting, is its relationship to medium and how she maintained a relationship to like sculpture, drawing, wood, marble, all of these things, while also being so engaged with photo and textual questions. And this is a picture of her in her apartment. She had this wall where she would put like samples of all these photocopies from different works together. And here's like the fifth point of the compass among all of these other things. Yeah, and I'll just end it here. This is my show. Yeah.
I was just about to take a pet go too, I was right. I could let go. As I saw it sitting without, it's really excellent, Right.
Thanks, great.
Yeah. The original, I think it's unique, the story and everything. I couldn't understand if I didn't listen. Really? It looks like right there from where space shuttle started to where it started, you see inside physically there. You think you got the world on the straight.
Yeah.
So the show is on view now at the Hessel Museum?
Yeah, it's up until May 28th.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and the brochure here from there's free brochures from the show. They have a little essay and poster. Yeah. Guy.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how it sounds like maybe from your comments that she didn't really think in this way at all, but if Bettina engaged in any kind of like historicizing of her own practice, it seems to straddle two really divergent or many really divergent kind of movements within art, also the time period. What is that?
Yeah.
Did she think about that at all, or was that a term for anybody?
She talks about the fifth point of the compass in her writings as like a document at moments, which like seems to bring it to its current moment. But there is like a real relationship between like modernist investments in like the transcendent potential of art and transcendent vision, and also like postmodern or like post-conceptual, like the arbitrariness of meaning and like the fragment referring to the whole. So there's a lot of like tensions in her work. I mean, she writes pretty ahistorically. It's like a lot more about like spirituality is much more at the core of a lot of her writing than history or politics, but she does mention it sometimes. So, yeah. Leah.
Could you talk? I mean, this work is so very situated in the place that it was made.
Yeah.
The fifth floor balcony of the Chelsea Hotel, which is, obviously a very historically important place. Could you
Totally.
talk a little bit about her relationship with the other residents and where she sort of like was within that ecosystem?
Yeah, she had a lot of friends there, and like when I would go there, like we had like a birthday party for her and all, like a bunch of current residents. We would all hang out, but she was definitely reclusive, especially in the 80s and 90s. There's like one of the archival documents that's in the show is this issue of Room Service, which was an internal newsletter for residents of the Chelsea by residents of the Chelsea. And there's like one issue from the 80s that features her and her work. She was definitely, I mean, I think in some, like if you look more into her, there's like existing stuff about her personality, and I kind of avoid that in my show because I'm really focused on this one project. But there's kind of like some tendencies to almost place her as like an outsider because she was kind of reclusive, but she definitely wasn't. Like she was going to Chelsea all the time and she was like friends with a lot of people at the Chelsea, but she was also, yeah, she felt like being reclusive protected her special vision. Like she writes literally about the importance of isolation for the kind of work that she's doing. But yeah, thanks.
I am so interested in how you worked with her when she was alive, because I didn't know that she actually passed, or I mean, I kind of assumed she passed, but I didn't know that you had a chance to work with her as she was alive.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of interested in that relationship, and like, I'm sure you'll continue more projects with her archives, just because, as you were saying, you were interested in this one piece that sort of opened up this amazing interpretation of her practice as it relates to a lot of art periods. But yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you were able to be a beholder after she let you fulfill life-wise and work-wise.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when I was working with her, like I kind of brought out some of the questions that working with her left me with, or like things that I was very compelled by, like aspects of her work that I felt very compelled by. And then there are other people doing work on her. So I think for this project, I like really looked at what I could contribute, which is like attention to this one work that hasn't been shown before, but is also like a methodology for approaching her work, which my methodology was like tracing one title. Because her works have these like nested titles. There's like the fifth point of the compass, of course, is like on all these different works. But then also there's this title, Studies in Random Constant, that's on almost like everything. And then there'll be like New York from A to Z, which is only on this one work. So my methodology was to trace this one title. Past projects, the methodology has been by medium. And because of my experience with her, I wanted to like propose another way of approaching her work, because it seems like medium almost becomes incidental. It's like more about this like movement between 2D and 3D that happens within individual projects. And I think also like this project, this process of doing the thesis, I just learned so much more about this work. This work is very generous, and I don't know that I totally expected that. Like I knew her and I knew her work from working with her, but spending so much time with it and her writings, it just opened up so much and connected to so many other things in this way that I didn't totally anticipate, actually. So that's been like a really cool thing to like retroactively also look on like the work we did together and the moments that I'd be like, you can't tell me about the idea. And now I'm kind of like, oh, I get it. Like in her vocabulary, like that word makes no sense, you know, in this paradigm. So yeah.
So getting back, thank you for this beautiful presentation. And I'm curious, in the aperture monograph, if there's a text or if you already talked about it, about this randomness, like don't search for context. I think there's a huge deep research there. I mean,
Yeah.
Is there any already research on that, or you're thinking about it? And what do you think?
There's one art historical text in the Aperture book that kind of gives an overview of a bunch of her major projects, like very quick overview. And she touches on like modularness and arbitrariness, but doesn't go into it because it's more kind of like there's a lot of work to be done. We'll say that. I mean, this is like a very emergent artist in many ways. Like there's very little attention to her. And all of these efforts, like kind of why I started with what's been happening is because even though those things might seem small, like it is about working towards that. And I mean, from this, I'm like, there's so many people I would love to be like, can you look at this and write about it? Yeah. Because there's so many like, you know, so many things like surveillance, what this means for New York City, like New York City history at this time, like how this relates to what was happening then. And also the fourth dimensional thing, like that's a huge set of questions. Also, she was very influenced by the Kabbalah. That's another huge set of questions, like the reciprocity of letters and numbers in the Kabbalah and language as like a medium for creation in the cabal, there's all these questions that I'm like, it would be great to have more interest, people who want to work on them. Yeah.
Hi, you worked with her as an archivist, is that what you were doing? Have you studied art yourself, I'm confused, like, you worked with her, what does that mean?
I was Ito Barada's studio manager, this artist, and she was doing a show with Bettina. So she told me to go to Bettina's and make this like rudimentary inventory. So I wouldn't call myself an archivist because it wasn't at that standard of archival practice, but it was just like photographing her works, measuring them, getting titles down.
What's your background? Are you an artist yourself? Are you studying art, or you were studying studying this?
I did my undergrad in sculpture and painting as an artist, and then I pretty quickly started working on the gallery side or working for artists in their studios.
Oh, okay, so you have been an artist as well as an intellectual.
Yeah.
Just curious.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, because you could have been just an archivist, so that some of the stuff in being young might be more difficult for you to like fathom in a certain way. But it's
Yeah.
good if you also try to create things yourself.
Yeah, that's definitely my background is definitely as an artist. Yeah, totally. Leah?
I was curious if, like, in your discussions with her or in your archival research, if, like, conversations around botany and ecology ever came up, just in the sense that I saw towards the end of your presentation and some of the skills, there were just kind of blow-up slides of, like, plants or, like, leaves, it seems, and, like, obviously, like, plants and leaves, like, obviously, like, kind of long history of categorization, typology, but also couched within, like, histories of philosophies of, like, immanence to the Broadway trees. So I was wondering if that
Yeah.
came up.
Great eye. Yeah. She had a giant project to photograph identify every tree in Brooklyn. And then she like scanned tree bark. She has all this tree identification by tree bark and tree identification by leaves. She has these scans of like gridded leaves. And she has this one that's it's like a leaf that's like kind of distorted. The symmetry is distorted, and she has this note that's like a dog peed on this tree, and that's why this happened. She's funny also, like, I mean, yeah, and that's a project that would be so cool to like, it's like then you start to be like, oh, the fourth dimensional geometry, and then the figures on the street, and then trees, and it's like, but it's also every tree in Brooklyn. It's also about the city and like trees in the city. And she said, like, there's in her that interview that resident did with her, she talks about the tree identification. She's like, I was looking at the bark and I couldn't figure out why I was so fascinated with it. And then I kept like redeveloping this photo and like reprinting. And then I realized that it's because there was a figure shape in the bark. And I think there's a aspect to her practice that's always trying to kind of like locate the human or like the human figure in pattern. So that's also like an aspect of that.
You mentioned that she was kind of socially isolated in Chelsea Hotel, but in her art practice, was she affiliated in any way with other artists or like conceptual artists? It seems so resonant of other artists' practices. And you mentioned a few, particularly women artists, but she was not in any way associated with them or affiliated with their practices.
No, she wasn't. Yeah, she definitely, she was like, everyone's copying me. She was like, I mean, and there's also some truth that a lot of like the other, like, the Chelsea Hotel now that has like a number of residents, and a lot of them are like artists who, for whatever reason, weren't able to make money off their work in their lifetime, which includes a lot of women. And there's a lot of talk among that circle about like work being stolen or copied. And the extent to which it's like true for Bettina, I'm not sure how relevant it is, because I think it was sort of like a truth of the moment, but she wasn't affiliated with other artists. She was, yeah, that's why it's like she was isolated and she wasn't part of a scene. But she also was not an outsider. And I feel like, yeah, she's kind of in that place.
If the show were to tour or to kind of kick off and go somewhere else, like, would you change it in any way? Or would you say how it is now at the Hessel is like how you would like it to stay if it were to move around to other institutions?
If I had more space, I would love to do a room on just the geometric work from the 60s and 70s alongside this piece. And like try, because that work is like part of why I focus on this piece is because it's like, I think an interesting way into what she's doing, and some of the geometric work can feel a little more like difficult to kind of grasp what she's doing and how it's like related to other things. And I would love to, show the New York projects alongside those would be amazing.
I guess I was just wondering, and this might be sort of, I mean, I thought it was supposed to project because you're doing such intensive work on a singular project for one artist, but the relation of like mysticism to like iteration in artistic practice, that's kind of a long array, like an interesting history that coincides with and maybe is paradoxical almost to the conceptual conceits that she's also working with. But the bringing of them together is really interesting, and I guess I'm thinking about the early 20th century painting that kind of mentioned mysticism is often like obsessed with the same or similar gesture. Is that something that you're interested in other artists where you're sort of picking up on this kind of work, or sort of where do you want those strings to go, or what are you thinking about with that moving forward?
Yeah, I definitely have thought about that. I mean, in my work, I was kind of trying to place her within this moment of like epistemological shift of cybernetics and how that really was like shifting like relationship to text and image and like analytic or descriptive media. But like then I found this essay that was about like this epistemological shift of energy to information, which is like this shift of like repetition. Like in the model of energy, like there's always entropy, like there's loss with every repetition. And in information, there's like a fantasy of like repetition without loss. And I think there's like some interesting, because she's so concerned with infinity, I feel like there's like really interesting things to go into about like what kind of like mode of repetition is she like interested in, and like infinity proposes like this lack of loss. But anyways, I don't know if that answers your question, but I just feel like, yeah.
I like comedy. I don't think the devil's better spread to keep the life that is consistent. But I'm not persistent all the time, but if I am resistant, but we can deal with denial. But in the long run, if we know what I know, we got to keep the life, right? But why is the devil prejudice?
Is what?
The devil, why is it red? It's all red.
It's red
You
because
think we're twisted?
no, it's red because she
Well,
had
the corpse is truth.
what?
Well, the corpse is truth. Only the truth is set us free. I just never have red hair.
It's red because she had that color in her apartment. Sure.
I'm making your point.
Yeah, her apartment was like black, brown, gray, and red. Yeah.
Just wanted to mention that being someone who's just a generation younger than her, growing up in New York City in the arts community, that all the thinking was based with a lot of spiritual things because of the work of Kandinsky and many early modernists that created all this new thinking in art to begin with. And so that's what influences all of us from that territory.
Totally.
And even my work today is of that nature. So I just want to say that to the general younger public here. We have this great influence around us for spiritual and psychological changes.
Totally. And it's very interesting because while she was raised Orthodox Jewish, she was from a community that rejected the Kabbalah and like not Hasidic.
Yeah, I
And-
come from that kind of background too.
Oh, cool.
I call my parents commie Jews.
But she came, like her copy of the Kabbalah was published in the 70s by a New Age, like eclectic and so it's like interesting like how these things emerge because of the moment, which was like really making these connections between systems theory and spirituality. And yeah. Any more questions?
I have a quick question. What was Ito Barada's interest in the work or connection to the work?
Ito, like many artists, like kind of follows in a tradition of caring for work by underrecognized people. Like she's done that a number of times in her practice. She had a big project on the French ethnographer Thérèse Rivière, whose work was kind of marginalized. And then Bettina is like kind of the person after Thérèse that she really has invested in. And yeah, I think like they're in the book, they're like one of the in the intro, this curator writes that there's a long tradition of artists like taking up the work of people who are ahead of their time and like caring for it, and that's part of the tradition this project is in. And like Ito also started the Cinema Riff in Tangier, which is like the first Moroccan film archive. There's a lot of her practice that's about preservation of marginalized artists. So I think that's kind of, and she just loves Bettina's work. I mean, there are like affiliations, like in the sense that like Ito has done a lot of work with textiles, natural dyes, and Bettina was a textile designer. And there's like in a lot of those drawings that was like these, like there's certain like investment in like pattern repetition that they share in terms of like the work itself. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.